And then, of course, after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, you could say 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. You could say 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But in any event, the end of the Cold War brought renewed vigor to international public law. This was the era of what the first George Bush called the New World Order. And we saw this almost immediately in the context of a war, the first Gulf War in the Persian Gulf. This was a war that erupted because Saddam Hussein who was the leader of Iraq at that time, invaded Kuwait and took Kuwait, and because of the argument that Kuwait was actually a province of Iraq. Well, the United States, along with dozens of other countries, including Russia, a previous big enemy, is now our ally, and the United Nations provides for authority to repulse Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and they do so. And this idea of countries collaborating with one another under the umbrella of international law, it was seen as a major success for international law. And because the first Gulf War, the idea was let's respect the sovereignty of Kuwait, and therefore let's push Iraq out of Kuwait. Those were the goals, and it was successful, and it was a very successful war from that perspective. Now, what we also saw in the 1990s was the growth of what became known as the humanitarian war. This idea that sometimes it is okay to go to war if the purpose of going to war is based on humanitarian concerns. We're going to talk about this in a separate video about Kosovo and the war in Serbia and Bosnia in the late 1990s. But the genesis of the idea of the humanitarian war actually came out of what was known as the Rwandan Civil War, the Rwandan genocide, in which the two competing elements, the two main tribal groups of Rwanda, were engaged in a conflict in which they were systematically genociding the other party. And the world looked on. The world was concerned. And because it's the 1990s and the growth of the internet and the World Wide Web makes it possible for everyone to be aware of everything in the world, this drew a lot of comment. But nevertheless, nothing was accomplished. And so after the Rwandan crisis, the idea was, look, we've got all this military that we built up over the course of the Cold War, and they've got nothing to do during a time of global peace. Therefore, let's use these militaries to liberate, to rescue citizens of a state from their own government. And so during this time period, we saw the growth of what came to be known as the humanitarian war, a war fought not because of an invasion of a country or not as a result of fear of an invasion, but instead a war for humanitarian purposes. And as we'll talk about in the other video, humanitarian war has now become the foundational basis for most of the wars that certainly the United States has engaged in. There's this aspect of we are invading a country to help that country. After 9/11, there was a movement away from international law. I told you that during the 90s there was this growth of the New World Order, this idea that it's a time of global peace. And in fact, the United States, as the sole remaining superpower, was prepared to lead what many would call the Pax Americana, the American peace. After 9/11, however, there was this shock and it's hard to describe just how shocked Americans were, but part of that shock was based on the idea that, wait, we thought a new world order was in place. We thought that we were moving into a time of peace and prosperity, which was the 1990s for the most part. And suddenly, it all came crashing down. And so the United States says, look, what did it matter that we had all these international agreements if at the end of it, we're going to be attacked and people killed and property destroyed? And so the United States, after 9/11, really saw itself as having different values from the rest of the world. And of course, because of its status as the only superpower, it eroded the need for countries to get along for amity and cooperation, because it's what are they going to do? The United States is the sole superpower. The United States has the strongest military that has ever existed, and so why don't we do whatever we want to do? And so this led to things like the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The idea, which was and the second Gulf War was very different from the first Gulf War. There was no UN mandate. There was no broad coalition between dozens of different countries. Instead, it was a coalition led by the United States along with a few of its allies to engage in this war. And the war was launched without the fear of, not based on any threat from Iraq to the United States, but instead the foundation of, we are going to save Iraq from itself. There's no other country that can do what the United States can do, so here's our chance. Now, what are the major trends that we are seeing in international public law today? First of all, we've moved from a system based on natural law to one based on positivism. So for instance, a natural law principle like freedom of the seas has now been codified in a treaty called the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which sets out those rules, which creates written rules for countries to follow. And so we no longer have to rely on this system of freedom of the high seas, but instead we are focused on these are the rights and obligations of a country in relation to travel on international waters. We move from an idea of customary practice to multilateral treaties, meaning large-scale treaties like the Geneva Convention, like the CISG, the Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods. We've also moved from a system in which there were a small number of states to a more organized system of global institutions. Now, one of the other aspects that we've seen in recent years is the world has moved from a state-centered system to one where the actors are of a much wider variety. So, for instance, one of the frustrations that the United States felt after 9/11 was, well, who do we attack? Who are we at war with? And so that was a huge frustration, because the 9/11 attack had been done by Al-Qaeda, an organization that's not a state, and a network. And so our first thought was, well, let's go invade Afghanistan, because they provided the shelter for Al-Qaeda and provided for the growth of Al-Qaeda. And then, so now we've moved from a state-centered system to one where the actors are of a much wider variety. And finally, we've moved from the 19th century, the idea that states have the ability to use force as an instrument of policy, to a basic principle of non-use of force, that countries should only use military force as a last resort. However, this last principle, of course, is subject to the notion of humanitarian war. Humanitarian war trumps the idea of the basic principle of non-use of force. So in conclusion, what do we learn today? There are different philosophical bases for international public law. The history of international public law is important. And there are arguments why international law is actually law. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the next one.